Hello everyone and welcome to Awesome Sharp Weekly, and in this video I'll be talking about how you can create macros in Swift language. So first of all, macros is a new feature of Swift language. It's part of Xcode 15. It's not really released at this point, at least Xcode 15 is not released, it's still a beta version. And what macros allows you to do is to create or generate code at compile time, which is great because there are a lot of times that you don't really want to write repetitive code, so you just put a macro on there and it will write the code for you. All right. The great thing about macros is that they are at compile time, generated code at compile time, which means that if there's a problem with the generated code, you will know at compile time. Now there are multiple types of macros. There are the freestanding macros and there are attached macros. You may have seen freestanding macros, like right over here. We are using a freestanding macro. It's already a built-in macro called preview, and it allows you to preview your Swift UI view. So instead of writing and conforming to preview provider and all that stuff, now this macro is much simpler and it's going to write the code behind the scenes for you. For attached macros, you may have already also seen attached macros, like observable macro, which makes your class or struct observable, and it can be observed, it can be binded on the screen, it can get the data. And I think if you're planning to use Swift data, then you may have seen the model macro. So all of these macros, the model macro, the observable macro, these are attached macros. They can attach to a struct, they can attach to any kind of a type. It can be a struct, it can be a class, it can be an enum, it can be a variable, it can be anything. So these are very powerful also. So that is exactly what we'll be learning, how to use an attach macro, which is kind of like this one. We're going to be creating our own on an enum so that we can create titles for our enum type. Now, let's go ahead and first create our project, and then we're going to learn a little bit about our use case. All right, so in order to create the macro, I'm just going to go to the file, and again, I'm using, you can see over here, Xcode 15 Beta 2. I'll go to the file, I will go to the package, and you can see over here, you have multi-platform, you have Mac OS and multi-platform, and if you select multi-platform, you can actually see Swift macro, and that's the template that you want to use. So I'm just going to go ahead and select Swift macro, and then you have to give it some sort of a name. All right, so let's say that if I want to give this macro, and you can give any name you want. I mean, you can say sharp. I mean, it doesn't really matter. You can give it whatever macro name you want to give. That's perfectly fine. Okay, so let's create the project. And when we create the project, you can already see that a lot of code has already been written for you. Okay, and if you go to the sources file, you have three different things. You have sharp, which is kind of like your file, which defines the different macros. So the only macro right now, freestanding macro that we have is stringify. That's automatically created. We don't really care that much about stringify macro. You can delete it if you want to. Then you also have the sharp client, and this is the main file. This is where you can actually quickly test it out, your macro. I mean, apart from writing an actual test for it, which is right here. These are the actual tests that you can write. Okay. And over here in the sharp macro, this is where you will write the implementation of the macro. I mean, you can obviously create a different file if you want to, but this is where you will write the implementation of the macro. Okay. And again, you can see that by default, it does come with one macro, stringify macro, which is going to stringify something. Like whatever you pass to this macro, it's going to kind of like stringify it. All right, you can see over here the implementation. If you don't want to use this macro, you can delete it. That's perfectly fine. You may have to delete it at different places. We'll probably do that later on, but you can do that if you want to. Here you can see how the stringify macro works. You pass in x plus y, some sort of number. It can be double or whatever, and then it's going to stringify it. All right, of any type, and you can see it stringifies it. We don't really care that much about stringify macro, by the way. we're going to be creating our own macro. So what macro are we trying to create? Let's remove the code over here from our main file. This is kind of like our test area. We can quickly test it out. We can write something over here, check to see how our macro is running. And our macro that we're creating is for enum and generating the titles for the enum. So what does that even mean? Well, let's say that we have an enum called genre, and these can be movie genres. So let's say horror movies, let's say comedy movies, right? We have kids movies, and let's say that we have action movies and so on. I mean, there are other genres available like fiction and science fiction and romance and all that stuff. And what we want to do is when we are creating an instance of this genre, and if I say horror, then it should print out horror as a string like this. So one thing to note over here is that the first letter will become capitalized so that I can display it on the screen. Okay, now there are many ways of going about this. I mean, you can go ahead and assign some value to it. Like you can say horror over here, like the actual value. You can say, comedy over here. You can say kids over here. You can say action over here. All right. So what does that mean? All right. Now, another thing, I want to actually make sure that this is not set to Mac. It's, not set to iPhone. It's set to Mac. And first of all, we do need to provide some sort of a default value for it, or what the value it will hold. So there we go. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that the value or the raw value of these things will be sharp. Okay. So let's go ahead and first build this application and see what's going on. I think it's still taking some time to build. All right, so finally the build succeeded. So this is one way of defining your enum, and all of these will become the raw value, right? So if I go over here and I go ahead and create some genre over here and I say action, now I can say genre.raw value. And that's perfectly fine. I mean, it is going to print out whatever the raw value is, let's say action, and that's perfectly fine. That's one way of doing things, nothing wrong with that. Me personally, what I usually do is I don't use string over here or assign these values over here. What I usually do is create some sort of a, property over here, like a title. And now I can perform a switch on the self. And now I can say, oh, if it's action, then go ahead and return action. Now, is that more code that I have to write? Yes, it is more code that I have to write. But I think it's a little bit cleaner. But that's debatable. Like you might say, well, I just want to assign the value and be done with it. I don't want to create a title property for all of this stuff. And that is fine. I mean, that's a debate for a different day, and each will have their own advantages and disadvantages, I think. One of the advantages of this approach that I'm doing is you will have access to, if these things will have some sort of parameter that you pass in over here, all right? Like year or something if you're passing over here. So now I can't really assign any value as a raw value. So that will be a little bit hard. So that's why the title, or just creating a title property, is going to, it's going to be much simpler. All right. Let's see over here. I have action, kids. I think horror is the one that's missing, right? So let's go ahead and add horror. So now using this case, I will simply go over here and create the genre.action, and I can say genre.title. I think it's a little bit cleaner, but again, that's not what we're discussing over here. That can we use raw value or can we use a separate value like title? Okay, that's a debate for a different day. Don't worry about that. If you want to use raw values, that is perfectly fine. If you want to create a separate property like I'm doing, that is perfectly fine. All right, no big deal. So we have this property over here, and I had to manually write this property. Manually. You saw me writing, took some while to write, and if we have more cases over here, then it will take me more time to write this, right? Wouldn't it be nice that if I don't have to write this myself. And I simply go over here into my enum for the genre, and I can simply say EnumTitle. And that it will generate all of this code for me. Think about that. I mean, that's pretty quick, I think, right? I mean, just putting a macro on the top, an attached macro, which can only be attached to an enum type, and it will create all of this for me. Yeah, that's, I think, pretty cool. But right now, there is no such thing as EnumTitle. But that is the purpose of macro. We can create a macro, an attached macro, which can only be attached to enums, which is going to go through all these cases, and it's going to go ahead and generate this for us. So we don't have to do this ourselves. So once again, we're not debating that whether this is good or creating the title one is good. We're not debating that. All right, that's a debate for some other day. If you want to use the raw values, that's perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that. If you want to use the title, that is perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that. We're just trying to see if we can put if we can create some sort of an attached macro, let's call it EnumTitle, which will just go through these things and generate the EnumTitle for us. Now, what about if they have these things? Well, that's a different story for a different day. Our case, our enum title macro is not really going to handle that. All right. So we're going to be discussing that probably later. So at least you have the basic concept of what we're trying to accomplish over here. We're trying to create a macro called enumTitle, which can only be applied to enums. And when it is applied, it is going to write this code for us. It's going to create a title property. And when we use the title property for each of the cases, it's going to return the string value with the first letter being capitalized because I want to display it on the screen. All right. So that's the thing that we're trying to do. The debate between the raw values and the title, that's for some other day. Here we go. Okay. So how do we do this? Right? How do we create EnumTitle as a macro? So we'll go back to our macro over here, which is sharp macro. It already has one macro defined, which is stringify macro. We don't really care that much about that. So we're just going to create our own macro over here. What should we call our macro? Well, start with public struct. We will call it EnumTitle macro. And there are many different types of macros that you can create. You can create like a peer macro, which appears right beside your actual implementation on which it is applied. You can have a member macro. That's actually the one that we want to create because that is going to add a title property within the same enum, within the same thing that is applied to. But there are a lot of other different type of macros that you can create. Okay. So now we are conforming to member macro, which is a protocol. And if you try to build your application, it's going to say that, well, you're not really conforming. Your enumTitle macro is not really conforming. So you must implement this function called expansion. All right. And the expansion function should return something. You can see right over there. It must return an array of Swift syntax.declaration syntax. So over here, just so that we can go ahead and compile our application, I'm just going to go ahead and return empty array. Let's go ahead and build it. At least it builds. I mean, our macro called enumTitle doesn't really do anything, but at least it returns an empty array. Okay. The next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that this macro can only be assigned to enums. All right. So this particular macro that we are creating, if you try to put it on a class or a struct or a variable or a constant, it should not work. It should just throw an error. So this macro can only be assigned, should only be assigned to enums. But how do we check this? Well, I can go ahead and create enum declaration equals to declaration, which is already passed to us in the expansion function. It's right here. dot as, and now we're going to go ahead and try to convert it to enum declaration syntax. If this particular conversion or casting is going to fail, then we're going to go ahead and throw an error. But what kind of an error should we throw? Well, the error that we're going to be throwing will be enum init error. And I can simply copy paste it. It's actually part of the documentation. So here is the enum init error. The only case it has is only applicable to enum. And in the description, it simply says that EnumTitle can only be applied to enum. That's it. All right. Or you can even actually say, if you have other macros that are using enum init macro, then probably you shouldn't say this. You can say this macro can only be applied to an enum. All right. Making it more generic. All right. So now we go back over here into our throw function, and we will say enum init error dot only be applicable to enum, because you are trying to apply a macro on something that may not be enum. Then we're going to throw this error. Next thing we want to do is we want to access different members, like the different cases on which you are applying the macro. But how do we access those different cases? That is the question. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a breakpoint right here on line number 50, and I want to debug this. And the reason I want to debug it so that I can start using this part, like enum declaration. I don't know what's in there, so it would be a good idea to see what's in there. Let's go ahead and see if it actually prints out. So if I say, I don't think it's going to print out as you will expect, so but we'll still print it out. I think it's not going to give us any information, but we will have different ways of printing it out. In order to debug this, we will have to go to the test. And you can see over here, we have these tests. Right now, they are only testing, what are they testing? Like the stringify thing. Now, we don't really that much care about stringify. So I'm just going to go ahead and write another test over here. Test EnumTitle macro. Now, tests are a little bit weird when you are testing a macro, because it obviously have to make sure that the thing that is generated, which is a string that is generated by the macro, is the real expansion string. So if I go ahead and say assert macro expansion, so now we are basically saying that the original source that I'm going to be providing is kind of like this. And then we have the expanded source, and then we have the macros. Like what macros do we have to test out? All right. So right now I'm not really passing anything in the macros. Right over here you see the test macros, and it only has stringify. I'm just going to go ahead and add another macro over here. I'll call it EnumTitle, and obviously the value will be EnumTitle macro.self. Okay. And then I can go ahead and pass over here test macros. Test macros. So the first argument over here in the assert macro expansion is basically how you will apply the macro. So if I go back to my main file over here, and I kind of like copy this, there we go. How will we apply the macro? Well, this is how we will apply the macro. We'll simply say enumTitle. That's it. All right. And then what will be the generated expanded source? What will this macro create? Well, let's go to the main. We actually deleted that. Let's see if we can get that back. This is the stuff that the macro will create, right? So I'll just uncomment that. And I will go ahead and kind of like copy all of this stuff. I don't know if the macro has to be part of it or not, but we'll see. And now I'll go back. I found that testing this is kind of like hard, because all of these things have to align correctly, and sometimes they actually don't. Now you can already see there's a problem going on over here. Hopefully I can simply paste stuff. There we go. And you can already see that there is a kind of a problem with the indentation and all that stuff, right? So if I apply a macro on genre, then it should create kind of like this. I don't know if I want to include the enum title or not, but this is the part that will be created, and that's the important part. All right. But I've seen that testing is fine, it's great, but since it's also based on the indentation, it takes a while for the test to actually, line up correctly. Okay, let's go ahead and run this test enum macro. So how do we test this out? We're just going to go ahead and press this play button. And right now, although we are running the test, our main purpose is so that we can hit this breakpoint so I can find out what's inside this enum del declaration, because it will be a very complicated tree structure. And using that tree structure, we have to find out that what are the different cases for each of these enum cases, and then we have to iterate through them and all that stuff. Okay, so that's the main thing that why we're running this test. So let's go ahead and run this test. And the test already failed. EnumTitle. Okay, yeah, we should probably not have this EnumTitle over here. And we should probably not have this thing over here. Okay, let's go back to the test again. And hopefully it's going to hit that particular point where we have breakpoint set. And once it hits that point, then we will be able to see what's in the enum declaration variable. Okay, so it is hitting that point. That's great. Let's go ahead and print out right over here. We will print out the value of enum declaration. Ooh, look at that. This is what is printing out. It's a very complicated, you can see, a deep kind of like a tree-based structure. And in this tree-based structure, if you look carefully, you will be able to find all the different cases that you need to create the title property, because you need these horror, comedy, because you need to find out what different cases are, right? Or else you won't be able to generate the code correctly. So what I usually do is I copy all of this stuff into kind of like on a separate file. And now I can stop this. I don't really need this to run anymore. And then we can look into how to get the value. Okay, so after copying that, I've already pasted it into any other editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code, but it can be anything that you want. And now what I'm trying to find out is that how can I get access to all the cases? All right, these cases are important because all of these cases will become part of the title property so that we can access the string value of these cases. So we have horror, comedy, kids, and action. So we have all the cases over here. We just need to find a way to access it. So all of this is basically enum del or enum declaration, which is right here. So if we want to access all the cases, it means that we have to go somehow to the member block, and then we will have to go to the members. So at least the members is now going to give us all of these different things, and then we can figure it out what we need to do. So let's at least do that part. We'll say members equals to enum del dot, not members, but it should be member block dot members. Okay, great. What's the next step? Well, if you go and look at the members, so members is now this thing. All right. All of these members are of type enum case declaration syntax. So maybe we can loop over these different members, because members is an array, and we can try to cast all of these different things as enum declaration syntax. So let's go ahead and try to do that. Let enum, or case declaration, basically, that's what we are trying to do. Case declaration. We have members dot compact map. If there's null, which we don't have null, but if there's null, then don't use that. Declaration dot as, and then we're going to try to convert it or cast it to an enum case syntax. That's the important part. then we will have the case declarations. Okay, once we have the case declarations, let's go ahead and see what's going on over here. Not compact, it's compact map. All right, so make sure we write compact map and not compact. Once we have the case declaration, now we're looking at the identifier. That is the one that contains the actual value that we need. So let's go back, and now I'll go ahead and say cases, case declaration dot compact map again. You can use a map, I guess, if you want to. And then we will get the elements dot first dot identifier dot text. So if we look at over here, you can see that there is elements dot first dot identifier and then the text. All right, so this is how we're iterating through this. So at this point, all the cases that we have will be there in the cases, and they will be in the text format. So the horror, the action movie, the comedy, the romance movie, the kids movie, all those cases in string format will be right here in the cases variable. The next thing that we want to do is to create the title. And this is where we have to append a lot of strings together to form that title property. We're going to go ahead and start with the title variable, or any variable, just assigning it to empty string. Next, we can go ahead and kind of like hard code a couple of different things. Oh, sorry, not empty string. We can assign some things that we want to. So var title string, I mean, we are calling our property title. So we are going to create a variable or property right here, computed property called title. So the stuff that we can hard code it, we're going to hard code this because this stuff is not really changing, right? Self. Okay, now we need to do something because now it's time for us to get those cases. So we'll say for title case in cases, and then we'll say title plus equals to, again, now a string concatenation, case, title case. So this will be the cases which is coming from our cases array, which only contains the values like string values, you know, like the horror and the action and all those things. And now we will put colon because that's the syntax for creating a switch statement. Title plus equals to return, well, that will be string. Make sure it's with string. And what do we want to return? Well, we want to return something in a string format. So again, I'm going to go ahead and say title case dot capitalized. There we go. And we have to wrap this so that it is a string. So I'm going to go ahead and add an extra over here so that it is string. All right. So now it's complaining that, hey, where is this capitalized coming from, right? So let's go on the top and see that if we can import foundation. There we go. So now it will have at least an idea of what capitalized actually means. After the loop is over, we can go ahead and add this. Plus equals to, I think we should add probably one more of this, right? So I'll go, let's go ahead and add one more. 3 quotes mean that I can now do new lines, and all the stuff that I'm going to be writing over here will be preserved. And there we go. We have closed the switch, I think the title property, braces, and the switch. And now instead of print, what we can do is we have to return the correct one. So over here, I'm just going to say declaration syntax, string literal, and simply passing in the title. All right. And that should hopefully work. Let's go ahead and build it. Now you can go and test it out. That's perfectly fine. Usually what I do in these cases is I try to start using this. All right. And before we use this, let's go and find out that what other things we need to make sure that we have it correct. So first of all, we have our stringify macro, which already comes with it, but we also need to expose our enum title so that other people can import it. So this is right now in a package, and in order to use it in your Swift UI application or any kind of application, you need to import this. So I will go ahead and say this. I'm creating an attach macro. It is a member-wise macro. And one of the things that is important over here is that you have to specify that if you are going to be adding an additional member, and yes, I will be adding an additional member and it will be called title because we are dynamically adding a title property, right? So that's why I'm naming it title. So that is what the member will be added, all right? Public macro EnumTitle equals to. So this is kind of like when you are kind of like registering the macro, and we will say external. The module itself is, well, the module that we are currently in right now. So the module will be remaining the same, which is sharp macros. And the type that we are using will be, let's say, enumTitle macro. I think that's the name of the macro that we have given. So we're going to use the same exact name. All right, let's go to build it. Okay, that's fine. Let's go to the main over here. Now we can test it out right over here. I mean, you can run your test also, that's perfectly fine, but we can quickly test it out over here in our macro. What about if I go over here and say enumTitle and build it? Okay, so already we are seeing some problem over here. You can see that if you apply the macro enumTitle, it says it is not found. So this means that we still need to go and register our macro somewhere. So let's go and try to find out. Here we go. You can see the sharp plugin. We didn't specify our macro. It only has stringify macro. Okay, let's go ahead and add that. So I'm going to say enumTitle macro.self. Let's go to build it. So that was an important step because now everything compiles. Let's go back. At least it doesn't complain. And you can always see that what it is generating. So if you want to see what this macro is generating, let's right click on it and simply select expand macro. Boom. That is what it is generating. Now you might say, oh, well, this format looks kind of weird. Yeah, I mean, it does kind of look weird. I think the switch is a little bit onto the right-hand side. We can definitely fix that stuff. Let's go back to our macro. Let's see where the switch is. There we go. I mean, maybe that will fix it. I mean, that's the hard part of like fixing the formatting stuff for the macro. It takes a little bit of time. Let's go back to our main file and let's expand it again. Okay, I think that actually looks pretty good, right? The reason over here, the main thing that you need to understand over here is that how quickly all of this code was generated. Let's say that I am creating another something, all right? Let's say that I'm creating, bank member. I don't know, it's kind of weird, and I can say over here, you are a flight, let's say, flight. What kind of a flight ticket that you're buying? So we have economy, that's how I fly, economy. And then we have, let's say, business class, I guess. That's what they call it, business class. Then they have, I don't even know because I only fly economy, so I don't even know what other classes are. Like A members or something, business class and, all of those different things. So let's say that you have these economy class, you have, business class, you have first class, all those things. And you want to make sure that all of these flight ticket cases have a title property that you can use. Now, I can go ahead and do that myself by using a raw value or something, but how about just this? Boom, done. I'm done. Let's see what it generates. Yeah, maybe that's exactly what I want. All right. Now, if this is not what you want, if you're like, hey, the C should be capital over here, then it's your job is to go into the macro and fix those things. But it's automatically generated. That's pretty fast. So I think that's very good. Good to know that it's fast and you can easily use it. All right. So now we have created a macro. We have tested it manually over here. If you try to test the macro over here, yeah, it may fail because it's very hard to match the exact indentation, but definitely work on it and see if you can match the macro. I mean, I'm sure that if I run it right now, the test will fail because of, how the indentation is actually compared. You can see it's failing, right? I found it much faster to just test the macro right over here with this, obviously with manual testing. But for more complicated macros, this will not be the case. You will have to write a very good test to check this out, check out the macro. So right now we have created the macro, which is great, but how do we start using this macro? Because right now this macro is only part of this package, and the whole reason we created the macro is so that we can use this macro in our SwiftUI project, in our macOS project, UIKit project, UIKit project, any kind of a project, we should be able to use that. So how do we use this macro in different applications? So let's go ahead and see how we can do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to close Xcode. Great. Now I'm going to go ahead and start Xcode again. Create a new project, or you can use an existing project. I'm going to use iOS app application, that's fine. I'm going to use to-do, list. You can call your app anything you want. SwiftUI is fine. Language is Swift, obviously, that's fine. And I'll create a brand new SwiftUI project. Now this particular SwiftUI project does not really have any access to that macro. So this means that we need to find a way to add that macro into our application. So let's go ahead and see if we can do that. If we go over here and we say add package dependencies, the package dependency in our case is not coming from GitHub or somewhere remote. It is a local dependency. So there is a button over here which says add local. And we can go on the desktop, try to find the folder where we have the dependency, and I think we call it sharp, so we're just going to use that. And let's say if we can try to do add package. Okay, now we get the sharp library and sharp executable. I think we only need the sharp library. I don't think we need the executable part of it, the client. The client was only for like quickly testing it out, and then we can add the package. Okay, so the package has been added. Now one of the important steps that in this adding the package is that you have to make sure that you close your Xcode completely before adding this package. All right, so I completely close Xcode and I open it again, and then I created this application. In other words, my package project for the macro is not open in another instance of the Xcode. It's not. Okay. Let's go ahead and try to see if we can import sharp. Okay, so we can import sharp, so that's good. And I guess I should be able to use that. Let's go ahead and see. If I say enum and I say genre over here, and I'll create the cases for kids and fiction, let's see if I can build it. All right, so I guess it is still building. Sometimes you'll see these kind of errors, unfortunately, that happens, no module, available and blah, blah, blah. And this problem, I have seen it before. So let's see if we can fix it out. All right, so the error was basically due to the build going on. I think it's still going on, so you can already see that. But we should be able to quickly test this macro out. We have imported sharp, that's our module, that's what we called it. And we should be able to simply decorate any enum, which doesn't really take any arguments, with our macro. So I'm just going to go ahead and say EnumTitle, and I'm done. We can always check that what this is generating. So I can always say expand macro, and there it is. This is how it is generated. And I think it's awesome because we only had to type in one small EnumTitle macro attribute, and all of this is generated for us. And now we can start using it. So anywhere you want to create an enum for the genre, we can use the title property to display the actual title, right? I mean, if I go over here and I create, let's say, genre, I can say genre dot fiction. And if I want to display that property, I can simply say genre dot title. There we go. Awesome, right? So macros are amazing. I mean, it does get a little bit of used to get familiarized with macros, and there are many different kind of macros. But always remember, with great powers, as Uncle Ben said, with great power comes responsibility. It does not mean now you know how to write a macro. It does not mean that you should be writing macros for every single thing. The code clarity is much more important than writing these cool macros. So make sure that if you're writing a macro, it is adding something to your project, adding a value to your project or to your code base, rather than making it more difficult to understand, because now you have like 30 different macros which are doing all the stuff which we don't know what's going on. All right. But at least this example is going to give you an idea of how you can get started with writing your own macros and what does it take to write these macros. All right. So hopefully you have enjoyed this video. Thank you so much. If you like this video and want to support my channel, then the best way would be to check out my Udemy courses. I just published a couple of different brand new courses, including a course on Swift data, which just announced. So if you're looking for introduction to Swift data, how to perform one-to-many, many-to-many relationships, how to use it in a UI kit application. So this is definitely the course for you. I'm still working on this course, but there are 4 hours of content already available for you, but I still keep on adding new content. Apart from that, if you are looking to get into full stack development, meaning you will create your server in Vapor using Swift language, and then you will create the interface in Swift UI. You will learn how to package and DTO, how to share information. Then that is a course for you. Mastering full stack iOS development using Swift UI and Vapor. That is going to tell you everything you need to know how to develop a complete full stack application. This is a 12-hour course with 111 lectures. You can see it's a very highly rated course. So definitely check that out. All right. Thank you so much. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Press the share button and the like button. Thanks.